He was stranded alone in a blizzard with no way out when he stumbled into an abandoned cabin no one had touched in over 40 years, and beneath its floor, a sealed door that would change everything. Before we dive into this story, make sure to smash that subscribe button because tomorrow we have an extra special story coming your way that will blow your mind. Let's get started. The mountain didn't care about him. That was the first thing Marcus understood as the wind hit him like a wall of broken glass. White, screaming, swallowing the road beneath his tires and erasing the sky above. He gripped the steering wheel of his truck, a banged-up Ford he'd driven for 12 years, and squinted through the windshield at nothing. Just white, just noise, just the kind of cold that doesn't ask permission before it starts taking things from you. It was late November, the kind of late November that comes with a warning and a silence before the storm arrives. He had been driving for 6 hours without stopping, heading north on a 2-lane highway that climbed into the Cascade Mountains like it was trying to disappear. No GPS signal, no cell service, just the hum of the engine and the occasional groan of the truck protesting the altitude. The radio had died an hour back, static swallowing the last station mid-song, and the silence that replaced it felt heavier than the storm outside. Marcus was 43. He looked older. His face carried the kind of lines that don't come from smiling. They come from years of squinting into storms, scanning ridgelines, reading terrain the way other men read newspapers. For 15 years, he had been one of the best search and rescue operators in the state, the kind of man other teams called when everything had already gone wrong, the kind of man families whispered prayers for when someone they loved was lost in the backcountry and the hours were running out. He had loved that work. Not in the way most people love a job, not for the paycheck or the title or the weekends off. He loved it because it was the one place in the world where his hands could actually do something that mattered, where the difference between life and death could come down to a single decision, a single step, taken at the right moment by someone who knew what they were doing. That purpose had been the foundation of everything Marcus was. It held him up the way a spine holds a man upright. Without it, everything else began to collapse. And then, 18 months ago, everything changed. It happened on a Tuesday, a clear Tuesday, the kind that tricks you into believing the weather will hold. A family of 4 had gone hiking on a trail that closed every winter. A father named Greg, a mother named Lisa, and their 2 sons, ages 8 and 6. They had been warned. The trail was marked. But Greg had hiked it a dozen times before, and the sky was blue that morning. And sometimes confidence is the most dangerous thing a person carries into the mountains. The storm rolled in faster than any forecast had predicted. Not a gradual shift, a wall. Wind and snow and cold all at once, turning a clear afternoon into a whiteout within 30 minutes. The boys were ahead of their parents on the trail when a section of ridge collapsed, blocking the path between them. Greg and Lisa were on one side, the boys were on the other. Marcus led the team in. He found Lisa first, hypothermic but alive, huddled beneath a granite overhang with her jacket wrapped around her shoulders like a prayer. He found Greg 20 minutes later, unconscious against a fallen tree, his lips blue, his pulse thready but present. Both of them would survive. The team stabilized them, radioed for extraction, and began working on the problem that mattered most: the boys. They were on the other side of a ravine that had filled with debris from the collapsed ridge, 50 feet of churned earth, rock, and splintered timber. The wind was still screaming. Visibility was near zero. The temperature was dropping another 10 degrees every hour. The team worked fast. They tried 3 routes across. None were passable. Not in the conditions. Not in the time they had. By the time the storm broke enough to attempt a 4th approach, 4 hours had passed. And by the time they reached the other side of the ravine, it was too late. Marcus never blamed the mountain. He never blamed Greg or Lisa or the boys or the storm or the forecast. That was the thing about grief. It doesn't care about logic. It doesn't care about the investigation that cleared him, or the commendation he'd earned 3 months before, or the 15 years of lives he'd saved. Grief settles into the bones and makes a home there, and no amount of evidence can evict it. He stopped sleeping after that. Not all at once. It was gradual, the way these things always are. First, it was trouble falling asleep. Then it was waking at 3 in the morning, heart pounding, the sound of rushing water still ringing in his ears. Then it was the dreams, vivid, relentless, always the same. A ravine, snow, 2 small voices calling from somewhere he couldn't reach. Karen tried. She was a patient woman, the kind who understood that some wounds don't heal on a timeline. She brought him coffee in the mornings without being asked. She sat beside him on the couch in the evenings without expecting conversation. She waited. For months, she waited. But there is a difference between a man who is grieving and a man who has made himself into a closed room. Karen was good at opening doors. Marcus had stopped leaving any unlocked. She moved out on a Wednesday in March, quietly, while he was out. She left a note on the kitchen table, 3 sentences, each one written with the kind of careful handwriting that told him she had rewritten it many times before she got it right. The note said she loved him. It said she could not watch him disappear. And it said she would be here if he ever found his way back. He folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket. He wore that jacket every day after. The department put him on administrative leave 2 weeks later. Not as punishment, as concern. His supervisor, a woman named Ruth, who had known him for a decade, sat him down in her office and spoke plainly. She said he needed time. She said the department would support him. She said she hoped he would come back when he was ready. Marcus nodded, thanked her, and walked out of the building for what he understood, without saying it out loud, might be the last time. He packed a bag that night. Not much. Clothes, the jacket with Karen's note still folded in the pocket, a sleeping bag, a thermos. He got in the truck and started driving north. He didn't tell anyone where he was going. He didn't know himself. He just drove, letting the road decide, letting the miles pile up behind him like days he no longer needed to account for. That had been 3 weeks ago. Now he was here. Miles from the nearest town. Miles from the nearest anything. The storm pressing in from every direction, and the truck dying beneath him like one more thing the world had quietly decided to take away. The engine coughed once, twice. A wet, strangled sound, like a man clearing his throat before bad news. Then it went silent. The truck rolled forward on momentum for another 50 yards before stopping with a soft crunch against a bank of packed snow. Marcus sat for a moment, both hands still on the wheel, listening to the wind tear through the trees above. The heater was already losing its fight, the warmth fading from the cab like color draining from a photograph. Outside, the temperature was still dropping, the kind of cold that didn't negotiate. He checked his phone, no signal, not a single bar. He checked the glove box and found what he had packed weeks ago, a small flashlight, a road flare, a first aid kit he hadn't opened in months. He checked the back seat, the sleeping bag, the wool blanket, the thermos of coffee that had gone cold somewhere around hour 4 of the drive. Marcus exhaled slowly. He had been in worse situations, not many, but a few. The training was still in him, buried beneath the grief and the exhaustion, but not gone. The first rule of survival had never changed. Don't panic. Panic was the thing that turned a problem into a catastrophe. He pulled on his coat, wrapped the wool scarf tight around his neck, and stepped out into the storm. The cold hit him like a physical blow, a wall of frozen air that stole his breath before it left his lungs. Snow drove sideways, stinging his cheeks, blurring everything beyond 10 feet into white static. He squinted, shielding his face with one hand. The road behind him had already vanished under a fresh layer. Ahead was the same, just a vague suggestion of ground, sloping upward into nothing. He stood beside the truck for a long moment, one hand resting on the door, thinking. Staying in the vehicle was an option. The sleeping bag was rated for cold weather, and he could conserve heat if he bundled up tight and closed the vents. But something in his gut, that same instinct that had guided him through 15 years of backcountry rescues, that quiet voice that spoke in certainties, told him the storm was not passing. Not tonight, maybe not for days. He needed shelter, something solid, something that wasn't a 2-ton piece of metal sitting exposed on a mountainside with nothing between it and the sky. Marcus grabbed the flashlight, tucked the road flare into his jacket pocket beside Karen's folded note, and started walking. The first 10 minutes were brutal. The snow came up to his shins in places, and the wind pushed against him with enough force to make every step feel like wading through wet concrete. His flashlight barely cut through the white, just a pale cone of light that illuminated the next 3 feet of ground and nothing beyond. The trees were his only guide, tall, dark shapes rising from the earth like silent figures standing watch, their branches groaning overhead under the weight of the storm. He followed the slope downward, away from the road, moving into the lee of the mountain where the worst of the gusts might ease. The logic was sound. Lower ground meant more tree cover, more protection from the wind. It also meant moving further from the road, further from any chance of help if someone came looking, but no one was looking. No one knew he was out here. The trees grew denser as he descended. Within 5 minutes, the howling had faded to a low, constant murmur, still present, but muffled, dampened by the wall of timber on either side. The snow still fell heavy, but it came down more vertically now, less violent, less angry. Marcus could breathe again, could think. He moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight. The ground was uneven beneath the snow, rocks and roots hidden just below the surface, slopes that could twist an ankle without warning. His flashlight swept back and forth in short arcs, scanning the ground ahead, the trees on either side, the darkness beyond where the beam could not reach. The silence between gusts was profound, the kind of silence that presses against your ears and makes you aware of your own heartbeat. That's when he saw it. He almost missed it entirely. It was just a shape, a darker patch against the white, something angular and unnatural among the organic curves of the forest floor. His flashlight beam passed over it once, and for a moment he registered nothing. Then the beam swung back on its arc, and this time something caught. An edge, a corner, the precise, deliberate geometry of something built by human hands. Cut timber, grey with age, weathered and worn but unmistakably shaped, unmistakably intentional. Marcus stopped, held the flashlight steady, pushed through a stand of young pines, their snow-laden branches scraping against his jacket as he passed, and then he saw the whole thing. A cabin. It sat on a flat shelf of ground, tucked against the base of a steeper slope, cradled in the curve of the mountainside like something the mountain had grown itself. Half of it was buried in snow. The drifts had built up against the lower walls to a height of 4 or 5 feet, smoothing the structure into something that could almost be mistaken for a natural formation of earth and white. The roof was steep-pitched and dark, dusted with a fresh layer of snow that blended with the grey sky above. A stone chimney rose from one end, cold and silent, no smoke curling from its mouth. No light, no sound, no sign that anyone had set foot near this place in years. Marcus stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, staring. In 15 years of backcountry work, he had found a lot of things in the mountains. Lost hikers, abandoned camps, the occasional forgotten structure from decades past. But this was different. This cabin wasn't just standing. It was waiting. There was an intentionality to the way it sat there, tucked and hidden, that went beyond simple construction. Someone had chosen this spot carefully. Someone had built here to be found only by someone who was meant to find it. He approached slowly. The closer he got, the more details emerged. The logs were rough-hewn but fitted tightly together, the kind of construction that took both skill and patience. The chinking between them, clay and moss, packed in with care, had held against decades of freeze and thaw. The roof, despite the weight of the snow pressing down on it, showed no sign of sagging or stress. The structure was sound, remarkably, impossibly sound for something that looked as old as it did. The front door was set into the wall facing him, wooden, heavy, hung on iron hinges that had darkened with age but still held firm. An iron latch rested in its housing, the metal worn smooth by years of weather and wind. One of the screws holding the latch plate had partially pulled free from the wood, but the door itself was intact. Marcus lifted the latch. It gave without resistance, no lock, no chain, just the smooth motion of iron sliding out of its housing. He pushed. The door opened with a long, reluctant groan, swinging inward on hinges that screamed for oil they hadn't seen in decades. Cold air rolled out from inside, not the sharp, biting cold of the outdoors, but something different. A dry, stale cold. The kind that builds in enclosed spaces over years, undisturbed, unchanging. It carried the smell of dust and old wood, and something faintly metallic, like iron left sitting in still air for a very long time. Marcus stepped inside and pulled the door shut behind him. The darkness was immediate and total. He clicked on his flashlight and swept it across the space. A single large room, 20 feet wide, maybe 30 long. Rough plank flooring laid with care and precision. Walls of unfinished log, solid and straight. A stone fireplace dominated the wall to his left. Large, well-built, the hearth blackened with soot from years of use, but clean now. No ashes, no half-burned wood. Just the dark mouth of the firebox, waiting. A cast-iron stove sat against the opposite wall, a chimney pipe rising through the ceiling in a neat, sealed joint. 2 windows on the front wall, shuttered from the inside with wooden boards, tight against the frames. A doorway on the far end led to a smaller back room, dark and still. Marcus turned the flashlight slowly, taking it all in. And that was when the feeling began. The quiet, creeping awareness that this place was not what it first appeared to be. Not abandoned, not forgotten, not left to rot and decay the way most structures did when humans walked away from them. This place had been preserved. The dust was thick, years' worth, maybe decades, coating every surface in a uniform grey film. But beneath the dust, everything was intact, pristine. A wooden table sat against one wall with 2 chairs tucked neatly beneath it, as if someone had just stood up from a quiet meal and pushed them back in. A shelf above the fireplace held 4 glass jars, their lids sealed with dark wax, their contents visible through the glass. Dried beans in one, rice in another, salt in a third, and something darker in the fourth that he couldn't identify from where he stood. A wool blanket, folded into a precise rectangle, lay on a narrow cot against the back wall. Beside the stove, a stack of firewood, seasoned, dry, cut to uniform lengths, sat in a neat row, waiting to be burned. No cobwebs, no mouse droppings, no signs of animals having used the space as shelter. Just dust and silence and the careful, deliberate arrangement of a life that had been lived here and then stopped. Marcus set the flashlight on the table, angling it toward the ceiling so it cast a pale, diffused light across the room. He stood in the center and breathed. The air was cold, but not frigid. The insulation of the log walls and the steep roof had kept the interior from dropping to the same brutal temperatures as outside. Survivable, more than survivable. He moved to the fireplace, knelt beside the hearth and reached up into the flue, feeling along the inside of the chimney for blockages with practiced hands. Nothing. The chimney was clear. No birds' nests, no debris, no ice. He found a small bundle of dry kindling beside the hearth, arranged in a neat bundle as if left there for exactly this purpose. After several tries with a small box of wooden matches he found on a shelf beside the firebox, he managed to coax a flame to life. The kindling caught, and he fed it carefully, adding a piece of wood from the stack by the stove. The fire grew slowly at first, then steadied, the flames flickering against the dark stone and casting long, dancing shadows up the walls and across the ceiling. Warmth began to spread from the hearth, thin at first, then gradually stronger, pushing back the cold inch by inch. Marcus held his hands close to the flames and watched the feeling return to his fingers, the pins and needles of blood flowing back to cold-numbed tissue. He stayed there for several minutes, letting the heat do its slow, patient work, before he stood and began to move through the cabin with purpose. He checked every surface, every shelf, every corner. The glass jars on the shelf, sealed tight, preserved. The tin cup and plate on the table beneath the dust, clean, unmarked. The wool blanket on the cot, dry, no mildew, no signs of insects. A coil of rope hung on a hook by the back door, strong, unfrayed. Everything was in order. Everything was tended to. Then he walked into the back room. It was smaller than the main space, 10 feet square, maybe less. A single window, shuttered like the others. A second cot against one wall, made up with another folded blanket. A wooden shelf mounted at waist height held a few more items. A tin of kerosene, a glass chimney lantern, a small hand axe with a worn but sharp edge. Everything was arranged with the same quiet precision as the main room. Nothing out of place, nothing forgotten. Marcus swept the flashlight across the room, cataloguing everything. And then the beam landed on something that made him stop mid-step. On the shelf, between the lantern and the tin of kerosene, sat a leather journal. It was old. The cover was dark brown, cracked with age, the leather worn smooth in places where hands had rested against it many times over many years. It sat on the shelf with the kind of quiet stillness that objects carry when they have been placed there with intention. Not dropped, not casually set down, positioned, deliberately, carefully, as if the person who left it understood exactly what it was and exactly who would eventually come and find it. Marcus stared at it for a long time without moving. Something in him, that same deep instinct that had spoken to him in the storm, that had guided him through years of rescue missions, told him this was not a casual discovery. This was a threshold, a point in the story where the ground shifted. He could feel it the way you feel a change in air pressure before a storm. He left the journal where it was and continued looking. That's when he found the name. It was carved into the wall beside the doorway, low enough to miss unless you were looking for it, or unless the light caught it at exactly the right angle. 2 words, cut deep into the log with a sharp blade, the edges of the letters darkened with age, worn smooth by decades of dust settling into the grooves. Edwin. And beneath it, smaller, etched with even more care than the name itself, a date, 1978. Marcus crouched beside it and held the flashlight close. The carving was precise, not rushed, not frantic, not scratched in haste. Someone had taken their time with this. Someone had wanted to leave a mark, a signature on the wall of a place that mattered to them. 1978, 47 years ago. He traced the letters with his fingertip, feeling the depth of the cuts in the wood, the smoothness of the edges. Then he stood slowly and walked back into the main room. The fire had grown stronger in his absence. The flames danced against the hearth, filling the cabin with a steady, amber warmth. Marcus pulled one of the chairs close to the fireplace and sat down, stretching his legs toward the heat. Outside, the storm still pressed against the walls, a low, relentless murmur that made the cabin feel smaller, more contained, more alone. He sat there, staring into the flames, and let his mind work. He thought about the cabin, how well it was built, how carefully maintained, how perfectly sealed against the elements and the passage of time. He thought about the name on the wall and the date beside it. He thought about the leather journal on the shelf in the back room, waiting to be opened. And he thought about something else, something quieter, something that had been pulling at the edge of his awareness since he first stepped inside. A feeling, not a sound, not a sight, just a sensation, low and persistent, like a vibration felt more than heard. The sense that this cabin was not complete on its own, that it was only the surface of something deeper, something below. Marcus shook his head slightly. He was exhausted. His mind was doing what it always did under stress, filling in the gaps, inventing the unseen, reading meaning into silence. He needed rest. He needed to let the fire warm him and the storm pass and deal with the rest in the morning. He leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes. The fire crackled softly. The storm carried on its low, endless song against the walls, and the warmth finally began to seep deep enough into his body that the tension in his shoulders and his jaw and his chest began, slowly, to ease. He slept. When he woke, he didn't know how long he'd been out. The fire had burned down to a bed of glowing embers, orange and steady, casting the room in a dim and quiet light. The shadows had deepened along the walls. The air had cooled slightly, but not enough to be dangerous. Marcus blinked, sat up straight in the chair, and listened. The storm had quieted, not stopped, but faded, the way a wave recedes before the next one comes. A lull. He sat in it for a moment, breathing, orienting himself. The cabin, the name on the wall, the journal he hadn't touched. He stood and fed the fire with 2 more pieces of wood. The flames caught, and the room brightened again. Then he turned and walked back into the back room. This time, he didn't go for the journal. He moved to the far corner of the room, the one furthest from the door, and knelt down beside the floor. He ran his hands along the edges of the planks, pressing gently, feeling for anything that didn't belong. Most of the boards were solid, tight-fitted, smooth, laid with the same care as everything else in this cabin. But near the corner, one plank felt different. He pressed his palm flat against it. The board gave slightly, not the way a loose board gives, with a creak and a shift, but with a hollow, muffled resistance, like pressing on the lid of something closed. Marcus looked around, found the hand axe on the shelf, knelt back down, slid the flat of the blade beneath the edge of the plank, and applied pressure. The board came free with a dry, splintering sound. Beneath it was a gap, a space between the floor and the ground below, 2 feet deep, dark and still. Marcus held the flashlight low and peered in. At first he thought it was just a crawl space, an air gap, common in cabins this old, built to keep moisture from seeping up through the floor. Normal, expected. But then the beam of his flashlight caught something at the bottom of the gap. Something that was not earth or rock or wood. Metal, dark, flat, smooth, a surface that reflected the light with a cold, deliberate precision. An iron door. It was set flush into the ground beneath the cabin, surrounded by a frame of poured concrete that sealed it tight against the earth on all 4 sides. Round, heavy, industrial. The kind of door designed not for a cabin in the woods, but for something that needed to be kept shut. Something that needed to be protected. In the center of the door, recessed into the metal, was a combination lock. Brass. 3 rotating dials, each marked with numbers from 0 through 9. The metal of the lock was clean, no rust, no corrosion, no weathering, as if it had been oiled, maintained, kept ready. Marcus stared at it for a long time without moving. The fire crackled in the other room. The storm murmured against the walls. The flashlight beam held steady on the dark iron surface, and the silence in the back room felt suddenly different, not empty, but full of weight, full of waiting. He sat back on his heels slowly. His breath came out in a thin cloud of vapor, curling in the cold air that rose from the gap in the floor. His heart was beating faster now. He could feel it in his chest, in his throat, in the stillness of his hands. Not fear, not exactly. Something older, something that lived deeper in the body than fear did. He could not open it. Not without the code. 3 dials, 1,000 possible combinations. He could spend hours trying them one by one. He had the time. He had nowhere else to go. But something told him that was not how this was meant to work. The lock was not designed to be beaten by patience or persistence. It was designed to be opened. By someone who knew the numbers. By someone who had been told. Marcus looked back toward the main room, toward the back doorway, toward the shelf where the journal sat in its worn leather cover, waiting. Edwin, 1978. He stood slowly, stepped over the gap in the floor, walked back to the fireplace and added another log to the dying fire, watched the flames rise, settle, and hold. Then he sat back down in the wooden chair, pulled the blanket tight around his shoulders, and stared into the heat. The night pressed in from all sides. The storm, the mountain, the dark and the cold and the silence of a place where no human being had stood for nearly half a century. And beneath his feet, beneath the floorboards and the earth and the concrete frame, an iron door waited with its 3 brass dials and its 1,000 possible secrets. Marcus did not move, not yet. Tomorrow he would open the journal. Tomorrow he would read every word Edwin left behind. Tomorrow he would learn who this man was and why he had built this cabin and sealed it away from the world and carved his name into the wood like a promise made to someone who had not yet arrived. But tonight he sat in the quiet and the warmth, and he let the mountain hold its secrets a little longer. Because some doors, Marcus knew, you don't open until you are ready for what is on the other side. And for the first time in 18 months, something stirred in his chest that wasn't grief, wasn't guilt, wasn't the hollow, aching weight of a man who had decided he had nothing left to give. It was the feeling of standing at the edge of something vast and unknown, and knowing, with a certainty that went deeper than thought, deeper than reason, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Morning came the way it does in the deep mountains after a storm, not with brightness, but with a slow, grey softening. The light crept through the shuttered windows in thin, pale lines, barely enough to see by, but enough to tell Marcus that the night had passed and the world outside still existed. He hadn't slept long, maybe 2 hours, maybe 3. His body ached from the cold and the chair and the weight of everything that had settled into him over the past 24 hours. But the ache was distant now, pushed to the edges by something sharper, something more alive. He fed the fire, watched it catch and grow, the flames pulling warmth back into the cabin like drawing breath. Then he filled the tin cup from a stream he found 30 yards from the door, a narrow thread of water still running beneath a thin skin of ice, tucked against the base of a granite outcrop where the cold hadn't quite reached. He heated the water over the stove and drank it plain. It tasted like iron and snow, and it was the best thing he'd had in weeks. The storm had not fully passed. Snow still fell outside, but lighter now, a soft, patient drift rather than the screaming assault of the night before. The wind had dropped to a murmur. The trees stood still. Marcus could see 50 yards in any direction, maybe more. Not enough to navigate, not enough to find the road, but enough to confirm what he had already understood. He was not leaving this mountain today. Possibly not tomorrow either. He stood in the doorway of the back room for a long time, one hand resting against the frame, looking at the shelf. The journal sat where he had left it, dark leather, worn smooth, patient as stone. The lantern beside it, the tin of kerosene, the hand axe, everything in its place, as it had been for nearly 50 years. Marcus breathed in. Then he crossed the room, reached out, and lifted it from the shelf. It was lighter than he expected. The leather was soft in his hands, not fragile, but broken in, the way a tool gets broken in after years of use. He carried it back to the main room, set it on the table beside the fire, and sat down. He did not open it right away. He sat with it in front of him, his hands resting on the table on either side of it, and let the fire warm his face while his mind settled. He thought about what he was doing, a man alone in a cabin, reading a dead man's private words. It felt like trespassing, not on land, but on something more personal, the interior life of someone who had chosen to be invisible. Edwin had carved his name into the wall and left this journal on a shelf and sealed a door beneath the floor, and all of those things were choices, deliberate, considered. He had wanted someone to find this place. He had wanted someone to read these words. But he had also wanted it to happen on his own terms, in his own time, and that time was long gone now. Marcus looked at the name carved into the wood beside the doorway. Edwin, 1978. Whoever this man was, he had been gone for a very long while. The dust on every surface told that story. The silence of the place told it louder. Marcus opened the journal. The pages were yellowed but intact, protected from moisture by the dry, sealed air of the cabin, preserved the way everything else in this place had been preserved. The handwriting was neat and precise. Small, controlled letters laid down with the care of someone who understood that what they were writing mattered and wanted it to be read clearly. No flourish, no decoration, just words, set down one after another with the quiet discipline of a man accustomed to working with numbers and records, and the kind of careful documentation that leaves no room for interpretation. The first entry was dated March 14th, 1976. Marcus read, "I have begun to build. The site is good. Sheltered on 3 sides by the mountain, open only to the east where the trees provide cover. No road within 5 miles. No trail. No one comes up here. I've checked 4 times over 4 seasons. The nearest settlement is a logging camp 40 miles south, and it closed last winter. I am alone out here in a way I have never been alone anywhere in my life. I don't know yet what I'm building toward, only that I am building away from something, away from the life I had, away from the work I did, away from the men I worked with and the things I saw and the decisions I was told to make and the ones I refused to make and the ones I made anyway because refusing would have cost me everything. I have left nothing behind, no trail, no record, no forwarding address. By the time anyone notices I am gone, the trail will be cold. I have made sure of that. For now, the cabin is enough, a place to think, a place to plan. I will write everything here, all of it, everything I know and everything I suspect and everything I have proof of. If something happens to me, this is the record. This is the only record that matters. Marcus paused. He looked up from the page and stared into the fire. The flames moved in slow, hypnotic rhythms, casting light and shadow across the walls in shifting patterns. He read the words again. Away from the work I did, away from the men I worked with, away from the decisions. He turned the page. April 2nd, 1976. My name is Edwin Harlow. For 22 years I worked as a senior accountant at Meridian Capital Group. I don't expect anyone reading this to know that name. Meridian was not a household word. It was not the kind of firm that appeared on the front page of newspapers or sponsored charity events. It was quiet, private, the kind of company that moved money in ways most people never thought about and never needed to. I was good at my job. I was precise, careful, and I understood the systems better than almost anyone else in the building. That made me useful. It also made me dangerous, though I didn't understand that until it was too late. The entries continued, one after another, each one dated, each one written with the same measured hand. Marcus read them slowly, not skimming, not rushing. He let each page sink in before turning to the next. Outside, the snow continued to fall in its soft, indifferent drift. The fire burned steady and low, and Edwin Harlow's story unfolded across 47 years of silence. The picture that emerged was not the story of a criminal. It was the story of a man who had stumbled into one. Edwin had joined Meridian Capital in 1954, fresh out of college, sharp and eager and unaware of the shadow that hung over the firm like a permanent cloud. For years he saw nothing wrong. He ran the books, reconciled the accounts, filed the reports, everything balanced, everything added up. The numbers were clean and the margins were healthy, and the partners smiled at the quarterly meetings, and everyone went home at the end of the day believing they were part of something legitimate. But somewhere around 1968, Edwin began to notice discrepancies. Small ones at first, a figure that didn't quite match between two ledgers, a transfer that appeared on one record but not another. He assumed it was clerical error. He corrected it. But the errors kept appearing, and they kept appearing in the same places, and they kept involving the same names. Names tied to a group of private investment accounts managed by a man named Victor Slade, one of the firm's senior partners. Edwin dug deeper, quietly, carefully. He told no one, not his supervisor, not his colleagues, not even his wife. He spent months pulling thread after thread, following the money the way a bloodhound follows a scent until the full shape of it became undeniable. Meridian Capital was a front. Not the whole firm. Parts of it were legitimate, carefully maintained to provide cover. But the core of it, the real engine that drove its profits, was a systematic embezzlement operation. Slade and two other partners had been siphoning money from client accounts for over a decade, moving it through shell companies, offshore transfers, and falsified records. The amounts were staggering. Tens of millions, then hundreds of millions, accumulated quietly over years and hidden so deeply in the firm's structure that no outside audit had ever come close to finding them. Edwin wrote it all down. Every transaction, every name, every date, every trail he followed and every dead end he hit and every piece of evidence he uncovered. He was meticulous, he was thorough, and he was terrified. June 19th, 1969. I thought about going to the authorities. I spent weeks thinking about it. But I know enough about how these things work to understand that going to the wrong authority would mean the end of me. Slade has connections, not just in the financial world, in government, in law enforcement, in places where decisions are made about who gets investigated and who gets left alone. If I walk into the wrong office with what I know, the information gets buried and I get buried with it, and I need another way. And so Edwin had found one. Over the course of 3 years, from 1969 to 1972, Edwin did something no one expected from a quiet, precise man who had spent 2 decades inside the system. He turned the system against itself. He didn't report the embezzlement. He didn't expose it. He redirected it. Slowly, carefully, using his position and his intimate knowledge of the firm's internal systems, Edwin began skimming from the stolen funds. Not from client accounts directly. That would have been traceable. Instead, he identified the shell accounts where Slade and the other partners had parked the stolen money and began diverting a portion of it, a small enough amount each month to avoid detection, into accounts Edwin created under fabricated names. He moved the money in stages through multiple layers of transfer, each one designed to obscure the trail behind it. It took years. It required nerves of steel and a level of patience that most people could not have sustained. One mistake, one wrong number, one flagged transaction, one moment of carelessness, and everything would have collapsed. Edwin would have been discovered, and what would have happened to him after that, he understood very well. But he did not make a mistake, not once. Not in 3 years of working in plain sight, surrounded by the very men who would have destroyed him if they had known what he was doing. By 1972, Edwin had moved a significant sum out of the stolen funds and into his own hidden accounts. Not all of it. He couldn't take it all. That would have been noticed immediately. But enough. Enough to make a difference. Enough to matter. And then, in the spring of 1973, Victor Slade began to suspect something was wrong. May 3rd, 1973, Slade called me into his office today. He didn't say anything directly. He doesn't do that. He talked about the weather, about the new office in Hartford, about the firm's upcoming restructuring. But his eyes never left mine the entire time. And when I left the room, my hands were shaking so badly I had to grip the railing on the staircase to keep myself upright. He knows. I can't prove it yet, but I know that he knows, or suspects, which with a man like Slade amounts to the same thing. I need to move faster. Marcus stopped reading. He leaned back in the chair, his eyes on the ceiling, turning the pages over in his mind. The fire popped softly. He could feel the weight of the story settling into him, the way sediment settles at the bottom of a river, quietly, without drama, but building with every passing moment into something solid and immovable. He looked down at the journal, still dozens of pages left, still more to come. He turned back to the words. The next 2 years were the longest of Edwin's life. Slade grew more suspicious. The firm began conducting internal audits, quiet ones, the kind designed to find irregularities without drawing attention from the outside. Edwin survived them all. He had covered his tracks too well for the audits to find anything. But the pressure mounted. He began to feel watched, followed. The paranoia was not irrational. Slade was not a man who tolerated loose ends. Edwin made his decision in the winter of 1975. He would leave, not just the firm, everything. His apartment in the city, his car, his identity. He would disappear so completely that no one, not Slade, not the FBI, not anyone, could connect Edwin Harlow, senior accountant at Meridian Capital, with the money he had moved or the evidence he had gathered or the life he was about to build from scratch in a place no one would ever think to look. He spent 6 months preparing. He found the land in the mountains, remote, unmapped, accessible only on foot during most of the year. He purchased it under a false name. He began transporting materials, a few trips at a time, hauling lumber and concrete and tools up the mountain in a backpack, working alone, telling no one. He built the cabin over the course of 2 years, working in it whenever he could get away from the city without drawing attention. He sealed the evidence, copies of every document, every transaction record, every piece of proof, in waterproof containers, and stored them in the vault he excavated beneath the cabin's back room. And he moved the money there too, piece by piece, in cash and in the form of bearer bonds and gold, untraceable, portable, immune to the kind of paper trails that could lead a man like Slade back to the source. By the spring of 1978, everything was in place. The cabin was finished, the vault was sealed, the evidence was secured, the money was hidden. Edwin had rehearsed his disappearance a dozen times, the route out of the city, the sequence of identities he would use to move south and then west, the way he would shed his old life like a snake sheds its skin and leave nothing behind but dust. He carved his name into the wall of the cabin on a Tuesday in April. He carved it not as a signature or a claim, but as a marker, a beacon, a way for whoever came after him to know that this place was not empty, that someone had been here, that someone had left something behind that mattered. Then he wrote the last entries in the journal. April 9th, 1978. I am leaving tomorrow. I have checked everything 3 times. The vault is sealed. The combination is written in this journal, the only place it exists. If someone finds this cabin, they will find the journal. If they read it, they will find the combination. If they open the vault, they will find everything. I don't know who that person will be. I don't know when it will happen. It might be years from now. It might be decades. It might never happen at all, and this place will simply sit here, quiet and forgotten, until the mountain swallows it whole. But I am choosing to believe it will happen. I am choosing to believe that someone will come, not because they are looking for me or for this place, but because they need what is here, because the world is not finished with this story yet, even if I am. The money is not mine to keep. It never was. It was stolen from people who trusted that the men managing their money were honest. Most of those people will never know they were robbed. The records I have kept will tell their story. Who took what, when, and how. Someday, someone will read those records and do with them what I could not. What I could not do was trust anyone enough to hand them over. Not during my lifetime. The men I was afraid of are still alive, still powerful, still watching. If I had gone to the authorities, the story would have been buried. If I had gone to the press, Slade would have destroyed me before the first word was printed. So I chose the only option left. I chose to wait. I chose patience over justice, not because I believed patience was better, but because I believed it was the only way to ensure that justice would eventually come. To whoever reads this, I am sorry I could not do more. I am sorry I chose silence over courage. But I did what I could. I kept the record. I kept the proof. And I kept the money safe until the right hands could decide what to do with it. The combination to the vault is below. 3 dials left to right. First, 37. Second, 84. Third, 19. Open it when you are ready. And when you do right by the people it was taken from. Edwin Harlow. April 9th, 1978. Marcus closed the journal. He did not move for a long time. He sat in the wooden chair with the leather cover resting on his lap, his hands still wrapped loosely around it, and stared into the fire without seeing it. The flames moved. The wood shifted and settled. The heat pressed against his face like a palm. $265 million. The number had not appeared in the journal. Edwin had never written the total. But Marcus had seen enough of the man's meticulous record-keeping to understand that whatever was in that vault, it was not small. Not in the numbers Edwin had described. Not in the scale of what Meridian Capital had stolen over the course of more than a decade. He thought about Edwin, the real Edwin, not the name on the wall or the words on the page, but the man. The quiet accountant who had spent 22 years inside a machine built on theft and had watched it operate with precision and silence and had done nothing for years because doing something would have destroyed him. And then, when he found the courage to act, he had done it in the only way he knew how. Slowly, carefully, invisibly. He had not been a hero. He had not charged into the open with his evidence and demanded justice. He had been a man who understood his own limitations, who looked at the power arrayed against him and made the only decision that gave the truth a chance of surviving. He had chosen to disappear. Marcus understood that choice more deeply than he might have, once. 18 months ago, standing in the wreckage of his own life, he had made the same one. Not to the mountains, not yet, but inward, away from the world, away from the people who needed him, away from the work that had given him meaning. He had withdrawn into himself the way Edwin had withdrawn into the mountains, sealing the door behind him, leaving nothing but silence where there had once been a life. The difference was that Edwin had left something behind, a record, a map, a way forward for someone who came after him. Marcus had left nothing. He set the journal on the table and stood. His legs felt unsteady, not from cold or exhaustion, but from the weight of what he had just absorbed. He walked to the back room, stood in the doorway, looked down at the gap in the floor where the iron door waited beneath its frame of concrete, 3 brass dials turning in the dim light of the fire behind him. 37, 84, 19. What happens next will change everything Marcus thought he knew about himself, about what he's capable of, what he's been running from, and what he was truly meant to find. Stay with us. If you're enjoying this story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. He knelt down slowly, reached into the gap and wrapped his hand around the combination lock. The brass was cold against his fingers, not the cold of exposure, but the cold of stillness. The cold of something that had not been touched in nearly 50 years. He turned the first dial. Left, the way most combination locks worked. He watched the numbers pass beneath his fingertip. 0, 1, 2, 3, counting silently in his head. When the dial reached 37, he stopped, held it there. His breath was steady. His hands were not. Second dial. Right this time. The numbers turned 0, 1, 2, and he counted again, carefully, precisely the way Edwin would have counted. 84. He stopped, held. Third dial, left again, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 19. He stopped. He held the lock in his hand for a moment, felt the weight of it, the mechanism inside, frozen in place for decades, waiting for exactly this sequence of numbers to release it, waiting for exactly this moment. Marcus turned the handle. The lock clicked open with a sound so clean and so final that it echoed off the concrete walls of the gap like a gunshot. The iron door shifted, just barely, just a fraction of an inch, and a column of dry, cold air rose from the darkness below. Not musty, not stale, clean, preserved. The air of a space sealed so perfectly that time itself had been held at bay. Marcus pulled the door open. It swung on heavy hinges, smooth and silent, oiled, maintained even in the decades since Edwin had last touched it. It opened inward, revealing a set of steep concrete steps descending into absolute blackness. The air that rose from below carried no scent at all, just the neutral, empty smell of a vacuum held in place by stone and steel. He stood at the top of the steps and held the flashlight down into the dark. The beam cut through the blackness and landed on the floor of the chamber below. Smooth concrete, grey and dry, stretching 15 feet ahead before the light gave out. To the left, shapes. To the right, more shapes. Tall, rectangular, arranged in rows with the kind of geometric precision that spoke of careful planning and unlimited patience. Marcus descended. Each step was solid beneath his boot. The walls on either side were poured concrete, thick, reinforced, the kind of construction designed to withstand pressure from every direction. The ceiling was low, 6 feet, maybe 6.5. He had to duck slightly as he moved. The air grew colder with each step, not uncomfortably so, but noticeably. The temperature of a sealed space, undisturbed by seasons or storms or the passage of years. At the bottom, he stopped and turned the flashlight in a slow arc. The chamber was smaller than he had imagined, 20 feet long, 12 feet wide, 8 feet high at its peak. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with steel shelving units, bolted to the concrete and covered in a thin, protective coating of what looked like epoxy. On the shelves, arranged in neat labeled rows, sat the contents of Edwin Harlow's vault. Cash, stacks of it, bundled in banded packets of hundreds, each one thick enough to fill a man's hand. The bills were old, not ancient, but dated, the kind of currency that had been circulating in the late 60s and early 70s. Some of the stacks were wrapped additionally in plastic sheeting, sealed with tape, preserved against moisture and air and the slow decay that money undergoes when left untended. Gold. Bars of it, small and dense, stacked in rows on one shelf. Each one stamped with a weight and a purity mark. They caught the flashlight and reflected it back in dull, honest gleams. Not the theatrical shine of polished metal, but the deep, quiet weight of something genuinely valuable. Bearer bonds. Thick envelopes of them, labeled by institution and date, sealed in waterproof sleeves. Bearer bonds. Financial instruments that belonged to whoever held them. No name attached, no record required. Untraceable, portable. The currency of men who needed wealth to exist without a trail. And documents. Dozens of boxes, each one sealed with a date and a label written in Edwin's careful hand. Transaction records, account statements, internal memos, photographs. The complete, meticulous archive of everything Edwin had uncovered during his years inside Meridian Capital. The evidence, the proof, the map that could lead anyone with the authority and the will to follow it straight to the heart of one of the largest financial frauds in the country's history. Marcus stood in the center of the vault and turned in a slow circle, the flashlight beams sweeping across the shelves, across the stacks of cash, across the gold and the bonds and the boxes of proof. The silence was total, not the silence of emptiness, the silence of fullness, of a space so dense with meaning and weight and consequence that the air itself seemed to thicken around it. He lowered the flashlight and stood in the dark for a moment, just breathing, just letting it sink in. $265 million. Not a rumor, not a legend, not the kind of number people whispered about in bars or printed in headlines about lottery winners and tech billionaires. Real, tangible. Right here, in front of him. Sealed in a room beneath a cabin on a mountain no one knew existed, left by a man who had disappeared into the silence nearly half a century ago. Marcus set the flashlight on the ground, angled so it cast a pale glow across the nearest shelf. He reached out and touched the edge of one of the cash bundles. The paper was cool and dry beneath his fingertips. Real, solid, present. He pulled his hand back, took a step away from the shelf, then another. He thought about what Edwin had written. Do right by the people it was taken from. The money was not meant to be kept. Not by Edwin, not by Marcus. It had never belonged to either of them. It had been stolen, extracted from the accounts of ordinary people who had trusted a firm to manage their wealth and had been betrayed by the men who ran it. The evidence in this vault could prove that. Could name the people responsible. Could, if it reached the right hands, begin to return what had been taken. But it could also destroy a man. It could bring the full weight of people and institutions that had spent decades protecting their secrets down on anyone who tried to expose them. Edwin had understood that. He had spent years calculating the risk and had ultimately decided that the only way to protect the truth was to hide it. Not forever, but long enough. Long enough for the world to change. Long enough for the men who feared this evidence to grow old and die or lose their grip on the levers of power that had kept them safe. Marcus didn't know if that time had come. He didn't know how much of Meridian Capital still existed, or how much of Victor Slade's network was still intact, or whether the names in Edwin's records were still powerful enough to bury the truth if it surfaced now. He didn't know any of it. What he knew was this: he was here, in this room, with this evidence, and the man who had hidden it had left a clear instruction for whoever came after him. Not keep it, not sell it, not disappear with it into the silence the way Edwin himself had disappeared. Do right. Marcus looked at the shelves one more time, at the cash and the gold and the bonds and the boxes of proof, at the quiet, patient order of it all. The work of a man who had given up everything else in his life to make sure this single thing survived. Then he climbed the stairs, closed the iron door, but did not lock it, and walked back into the cabin. The fire was still burning. The snow still fell outside. The mountain still held its silence around the small, warm room where a dead man's journal lay open on the table and a vault full of stolen wealth waited beneath the floor. Marcus sat down in the chair, picked up the journal, flipped back through the pages to the section he had passed over too quickly. The early entries, the ones Edwin had written not about money or evidence, but about himself, about his life before the cabin, about the people he had left behind. He found the passage he was looking for. February 22nd, 1977. Claire turned 7 today. I know this because I have been counting the days since I left. Every single one. I have a calendar on the wall of the cabin, and I have marked each day with a small line, and today there are 2,523 of them. She doesn't know I am alive. Her mother told her I had gone away on business and wouldn't be coming back. I asked her to say that. It was the kindest lie I could think of, better than the truth, which is that her father left because he was afraid, and he left without saying goodbye because he was afraid of that too. If someone finds this place after I am gone, if someone reads these words, I want them to know about Claire, not because I expect them to find her, but because she is the reason I kept the record. She is the reason I didn't destroy the evidence and disappear into nothing, because someday she might want to know who her father was. And someday she might want to know that he tried, in his own quiet, cowardly, imperfect way, to do the right thing. Her mother's name is Ruth. We lived in Hartford. If any of this still means anything, 50 or 100 years from now, maybe someone can find them. Marcus closed the journal. He held it in his hands and stared at the cover for a long time. The leather was warm now from his body heat, soft against his palms. A man's life compressed into pages. A father who left a daughter behind to protect a truth. A man who chose silence over courage, as he had written himself, but who had, in that silence, built something that might outlast him. Something that might, in the end, mean more than anything he could have done while he was alive and visible and afraid. Marcus set the journal down gently, carefully. The way you set down something fragile. Outside, the snow continued to fall. The mountain held its quiet, and beneath the cabin floor, behind an unlocked iron door, $265 million waited in the dark, patient, silent, and ready for whatever came next. The storm broke on the third day. Marcus watched it happen from the cabin doorway, the clouds thinning like smoke dissolving in still air, the grey giving way to something paler, and then, for the first time since he had stumbled out of his truck in the dark, a sliver of blue. It was weak, tentative, the kind of blue that appeared and disappeared in moments. But it was there. The mountain was letting him see again. He did not leave. He told himself it was practical. The snow was still too deep to navigate safely. The road was buried. His truck was likely frozen solid beneath a drift that had built up another foot since he had last seen it. All of that was true. All of that gave him a reason to stay that did not require honesty. The real reason was the vault. He had not slept well since opening it, not because of fear, though fear was there, quiet and persistent, like a sound heard through walls. It was something else. Something closer to what he had felt in the years before the rescue that ended his career, back when the work still meant something, back when he would lie awake at night running through scenarios in his head, not out of anxiety, but out of responsibility. The feeling that something depended on him, that a decision was waiting, and he was the only one who could make it. He spent the fourth day in the vault. He went through the boxes one at a time, reading Edwin's records with the same slow, deliberate care the man had used to write them. Transaction by transaction, name by name, date by date. The picture that emerged was larger than Edwin had described in the journal, larger, in fact, than Edwin might have fully understood. The embezzlement at Meridian Capital had not been limited to the partners Marcus had already read about. It spread outward through the firm like roots beneath a tree, touching subsidiary companies, affiliated funds, and a network of intermediaries that stretched across state lines and, in some cases, across borders. Some of those names, Marcus noticed, were not old. Some of the companies referenced in the later documents, the ones Edwin had compiled in the final months before he disappeared, were not defunct. They had new names now, new faces, new addresses, but the structures were the same. The methods were the same. The money moved the same way it always had, through the same channels, into the same shadows. Meridian Capital was gone, but what it had built was not. Marcus sat on the floor of the vault with a stack of documents spread around him, the flashlight propped against a gold bar to keep the light steady. and felt the weight of it settle into his chest like a stone dropped into still water. This was not a relic, not a piece of history buried safely in the past. This was a living wound, still bleeding, still affecting people who had no idea it existed. Edwin had understood that, Marcus realized. He had written about it in one of the later journal entries, a passage Marcus had read twice but only now fully absorbed. The money is not the point. The money is only the proof that the wound is real. The documents are the cure. Without them, the money is just cash. Valuable, yes, but meaningless in the larger sense. With them, it is a weapon. A weapon that can be aimed at the men who built this system and used to dismantle it. Marcus closed the box he had been reading and sat in the quiet of the vault for a long time. The flashlight flickered once, then steadied. Above him, through the iron door and the floorboards and the earth and the snow, the mountain held its silence. It was on the 5th morning that he saw the man. Marcus had stepped outside to collect more firewood from the stack Edwin had left beneath a tarp behind the cabin. The air was sharp and clear. The storm had passed entirely now, leaving behind a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at, and a stillness so complete that every sound carried. His own boots on the packed snow, the creak of the tarp as he pulled it back, the soft thud of logs as he stacked them in his arms. And then at the edge of the tree line, a figure. Marcus stopped. The logs stayed balanced in his arms. He did not move, did not breathe. The man stood at the boundary where the trees met the clearing, maybe 60 yards away, half hidden by the trunk of a tall pine. He was dressed for the cold, dark jacket, dark pants, boots with cleats for the ice. He was not large, not imposing, but there was something in the way he stood, still, watchful, patient, that told Marcus this was not a lost hiker stumbling across an unfamiliar cabin. This man knew exactly where he was. They looked at each other across the snow. The silence stretched. Then the man turned without hurry, without urgency, and walked back into the trees. Within seconds, the forest had swallowed him whole, as if he had never been there at all. Marcus stood in the clearing for a full minute after the man disappeared, the firewood growing heavy in his arms, his heart beating a rhythm he hadn't felt since the mountains had last asked something of him. He went back inside and locked the door. That night, he did not sleep. He sat in the chair by the fire with Edwin's journal open on his lap, reading the same passage over and over, the one about Claire, Edwin's daughter. 7 years old when he left. No last name given. Edwin had written only Ruth, the mother's name, and the city, Hartford. Claire would be 53 now, maybe 54. Old enough to have built a life of her own. Old enough to have stopped looking for answers about a father who vanished without explanation when she was barely old enough to remember his face. Or maybe she hadn't stopped. Maybe she had spent decades looking, searching records, hiring investigators, following threads that led nowhere. The kind of quiet, relentless searching that people do when the absence of an answer feels worse than any answer could. Marcus closed the journal and stared into the fire. Two things sat side by side in his mind now, pressing against each other like tectonic plates. The vault, the money, the evidence, the power to expose decades of theft and return what had been stolen. And Claire, a woman he had never met, had never heard of until 5 days ago, who was the only living connection to the man who had built this place and left this record and trusted that someday someone would come. The man at the tree line appeared again on the 6th morning. Marcus saw him from the window this time. A dark shape at the same spot, same distance, same posture. Watching. Waiting. He did not come closer. He did not call out. He simply stood there, visible, making no effort to hide, and then, after several minutes, disappeared back into the trees. Marcus spent the afternoon in the vault, but he was no longer reading. He was thinking, organizing. He pulled the boxes of documents into a rough timeline, the earliest records first, the most recent last. He separated the financial evidence from the personal records. He set aside the bearer bonds and identified which ones might still carry value. And he made a list, careful, precise, the way Edwin would have made it, of everything in the room and what it meant, and what it could prove. By evening, he had a clear picture. And with that picture came a decision that had been forming since the moment he first opened the iron door. He could not do this alone. The evidence needed to reach someone with the authority to act on it. Someone outside the reach of whatever network had kept Meridian's secrets buried for 50 years. Someone who could be trusted, not with faith, but with verification. Someone whose record was clean and whose motivations could be checked. And before any of that, before the evidence went anywhere, Edwin's daughter deserved to know. Not just that her father had been here. Not just that he had survived, for a time at least, after disappearing from her life, but why. What he had done and why he had done it, and what he had left behind. Claire deserved the truth about the man who had loved her enough to stay silent. Marcus sat on the edge of the cot in the back room, the flashlight casting long shadows up the walls, and looked at the gap in the floor where the iron door waited, unlocked now, open to the chamber below. $265 million. A lifetime of evidence. A dead man's last wish, written in careful handwriting on yellowed pages. And somewhere in the trees outside, a man who had come to this mountain for a reason Marcus did not yet understand, but was beginning to suspect. The man in the dark jacket had not come by accident. He had not wandered here. He had tracked this place down, which meant someone, somewhere, still knew about it, or had been looking for it, or had been watching, the way Edwin had once feared being watched, for exactly this moment, the moment when someone opened the door that had been sealed for nearly half a century. Marcus looked down at his hands, calloused, scarred from years of rope burns and rock scrapes and the kind of work that left marks. Hands that had once pulled people from ledges and carried children down mountains and done the things that mattered when nothing else could. He had spent 18 months believing those hands were useless now, that the best work they could do was already behind him. Edwin Harlow had believed something different. He had believed that the right hands would come along, hands that could hold what he had built, could carry it forward, could finish what he had started in silence and fear and quiet, stubborn hope. Marcus looked at the iron door one more time, at the vault below, at everything Edwin had left for a stranger he would never meet. Then he stood, picked up the journal, and began to plan. Marcus did not sleep that night. He sat in the chair by the dying fire, the journal open on his lap. A page he had read a dozen times now spread before him in the amber glow. Edwin's words. Claire, Ruth, Hartford. A daughter left behind by a man who believed disappearing was the only way to protect her. The fire burned down to embers. The cabin grew cold around him, and he did not move to feed it. He was thinking, not the scattered, anxious thinking of a man without direction, but the slow, deliberate kind. The kind that built plans the way Edwin had built this cabin. One piece at a time, tested for strength before the next was added. By morning, he knew what he had to do. The first step was the hardest. Not because it required courage, though it did. It required trust. And trust was something Marcus had spent 18 months sealing away inside himself, locking it down alongside everything else that had once made him who he was. He needed to make contact. He needed to reach the outside world. The truck was still buried. The road was still impassable on foot. But Marcus had spent 15 years in these mountains, and he knew that isolation was rarely absolute. He spent the morning of the 7th day exploring the ridge above the cabin, climbing through knee-deep snow until the trees thinned and the ground leveled out on a flat shelf of rock that overlooked a valley to the east. From there, he held his phone above his head and waited. One bar, flickering, barely there. He typed a single text message and sent it before the signal could die. It was addressed to Ruth Harlow. He had found the name in Edwin's records, not just Ruth, but a full address, a phone number from the 1970s that would be decades out of date. He did not use that number. Instead, he searched. It took 20 minutes of intermittent signal and careful, deliberate keystrokes, but he found her. Ruth Harlow, now Ruth Callahan, 68 years old, living in a small town outside Hartford, Connecticut. And beside her name, on a social media profile that had not been updated in over a year, a photograph, A woman with graying hair and tired eyes, and beside her, in a smaller photo linked from the same page, a younger woman. Dark hair, sharp features, a face that carried the same quiet intensity Marcus had seen in Edwin's handwriting. Careful, controlled, deliberate. Claire. The text message was short. He wrote it 3 times before he was satisfied. My name is Marcus. I have found something that belongs to your father, something he left for you. I know this is difficult to believe from a stranger, but I have proof. I need to meet with you. Please respond when you can. I will explain everything. He included the location, not the cabin itself, but a town at the base of the mountain, a place with a highway and a diner, and enough public space that a stranger's presence would not draw undue attention. He included a date, 3 days from now, enough time for the snow to settle and for him to find a way down. Then he sent it and lowered the phone. The signal died immediately. The mountain swallowed it whole, the way it swallowed everything, quietly, without drama, without acknowledgement. Marcus stood on the ridge for a long time afterward, looking out over the valley. The sky was clear for the first time since the storm, a vast pale blue that stretched from horizon to horizon, unmarred by clouds. The snow below him gleamed white and still, untouched by anything but wind and light. It was beautiful in the way that places are beautiful when no one is watching them. Silent, indifferent, ancient. He thought about the man in the dark jacket. He had not seen him since the 6th morning. Not a shadow, not a footprint, nothing. But the feeling of being watched had not faded. It had simply gone quiet, the way a heartbeat goes quiet when you stop listening for it. Still there, still present, waiting. Marcus descended back to the cabin and spent the afternoon preparing. He did not move the money, not yet. The cash and the gold and the bearer bonds stayed where Edwin had placed them, undisturbed, protected by the vault's sealed air and concrete walls. But he did move the documents. All of them. He carried the boxes up from the vault one at a time and stacked them in the main room beside the fireplace, where the warmth would keep them dry. He sorted them again, transaction records in one pile, internal memos in another, photographs and correspondence in a third. He labeled each stack with strips of paper and Edwin's careful hand, copying the categories from the original boxes. When he was finished, the cabin looked less like a shelter and more like a war room. Papers covered the table, the cot, the floor beside the fire. The leather journal sat at the center of it all, open to the page where Edwin had written the combination to the vault and the words that followed it. Do right by the people it was taken from. On the 2nd day after sending the message, Marcus found a way down. The snow had packed hard overnight, forming a crust firm enough to walk on if he moved carefully, testing each step before shifting his weight. He followed the slope downward for 3 hours, picking his way through the trees, using the terrain the way he had been trained, reading the contours of the mountain like a map, avoiding the places where the snow was soft and deep, staying on the ridges where the wind had scoured it thin. By midday, he reached the highway. His truck was exactly where he had left it, buried to the bumpers, the cab barely visible beneath a drift that had since been compacted by cold into something close to ice. He did not try to dig it out. Instead, he walked along the road for 2 miles until he found a logging access point where a county plow had cleared a path. From there, he flagged down a passing pickup driven by a man named Tom, who asked no questions and dropped him at a gas station on the outskirts of a town called Bridger Falls. Marcus used the payphone outside. He called the number he had found online for a woman named Sandra Voss, a federal prosecutor in the Eastern District of Connecticut. He had spent an entire evening researching her, reading everything he could find in the intermittent signal available on the mountain ridge. Sandra Voss had a 20-year record of prosecuting financial crimes. She had taken down 3 separate fraud operations in the past decade alone. She was not connected to Meridian Capital or any of its affiliates. Her record was clean, her reputation was earned, and she was not the kind of woman who backed down when powerful people told her to stop digging. The phone rang 4 times. A secretary answered. Marcus gave his name and asked for 10 minutes of the prosecutor's time. He said the words he knew would get him through: financial fraud, decades of evidence, and a vault. He was transferred within 30 seconds. Sandra Voss had a voice like someone who had spent years in courtrooms, measured, precise, with an authority that did not need volume to make itself felt. She listened without interrupting as Marcus explained in broad strokes what he had found. The cabin, the vault, the journal, Edwin Harlow, Meridian Capital, the money, the evidence, all of it. When he finished, there was a silence on the other end of the line. Not the silence of disbelief, the silence of someone calculating, weighing, deciding. Then she spoke. "Where are you right now?" "Bridger Falls, a gas station on Route 9. Another pause. "Stay there. I'm sending someone to you. Do not leave that location. Do not contact anyone else. Do not go back to the cabin alone." "I need to meet someone first," Marcus said. "Edwin Harlow's daughter. Her name is Claire. She deserves to know what her father did before anyone else sees this." Sandra was quiet for a moment. Then, "Agreed, but not alone. I'm sending an agent, someone I trust. They'll escort you to the meeting and make sure everything stays secure." The line went dead. Marcus hung up the phone and stood in the cold, watching his breath curl in the air. The gas station buzzed with fluorescent light behind him. A truck rumbled past on the highway. The world moved on the way it always did, indifferent to the fact that somewhere on the mountain behind him a door had been opened that could not be closed again. Claire Harlow, she had kept her father's name even decades after he disappeared, arrived at the diner in Bridger Falls on a Tuesday afternoon. She drove a grey sedan, practical and clean, and she parked it with the kind of careful precision that suggested a woman who paid attention to details. She was 53. The photograph Marcus had seen online had not done her justice, or rather, it had captured only the surface of her. In person, there was a depth to her face, a complexity in her eyes that spoke of years spent searching for something and not finding it. Not yet. Marcus was already inside, seated in a booth near the back. Beside him sat a woman in a dark blazer, Agent Maren Cole, the federal liaison Sandra Voss had sent. She was quiet, professional, and carried herself with the kind of calm authority that suggested she had been in rooms like this before, with stakes like these, and had learned not to let the weight of it show on her face. Claire walked in and stopped. She scanned the room once, quickly, efficiently, the way someone does when they have spent years looking for things that might or might not be there. Her eyes landed on Marcus, then on Agent Cole, and she went very still. She did not sit down right away. She stood at the edge of the booth and looked at Marcus with an expression he could not quite read, not hostile, not afraid. Something between hope and caution. The expression of a woman who had been disappointed before and had learned to brace herself before believing anything. "You're Marcus," she said. It was not a question. He nodded. "Thank you for coming." She looked at Agent Cole, who offered a small nod of confirmation. Then Claire sat down across from Marcus, set her purse on the table, and folded her hands in front of her. Her fingers were steady. Her jaw was set. "Tell me," she said. Marcus told her everything. He told her about the storm and the truck and the cabin buried in the snow. He told her about the name on the wall and the date carved beside it. He told her about the journal, Edwin's words, Edwin's story, Edwin's careful, patient, terrified plan to preserve the truth until someone came along who could carry it forward. He told her about the vault and what it held, and he told her about the passage Edwin had written about her. About Claire, age 7, counting the days since her father left, not knowing he was alive, not knowing why he had gone, not knowing that everything he did after that moment was, in some quiet and complicated way, for her. Claire did not interrupt. She did not cry. She sat in the booth with her hands folded and her eyes fixed on Marcus's face, and she listened the way Edwin had listened when he kept his records, with total, unwavering attention, every word absorbed, every detail noted, nothing missed. When Marcus finished, the diner was quiet around them. The coffee machine hissed in the background. Someone laughed at a table near the door. The ordinary sounds of an ordinary afternoon, indifferent to the extraordinary thing happening in the back booth. Claire was silent for a long time. Then she unfolded her hands and placed them flat on the table, palms down, the way someone does when they need to feel something solid beneath them. "He was alive," she said. Not a question. A statement. The kind that comes after decades of wondering, decades of not knowing, decades of being told, by her mother, by well-meaning relatives, by the slow passage of time itself, that some doors stay closed forever. For a while, Marcus said carefully. The journal covers 1976 through 1978. After that, there are no more entries. I don't know how long he stayed on that mountain or where he went after, but the cabin is still standing. Everything he built is still there. Claire nodded slowly. Her eyes had gone bright, but she held whatever was rising inside her with the same quiet discipline Marcus had seen in Edwin's handwriting. She breathed in, breathed out. And then she looked at Agent Cole. What happens now? Agent Cole leaned forward slightly. We secure the vault, we catalogue the evidence. Prosecutor Voss's office takes custody of the documents and begins building a case. The financial assets, the cash, the gold, the bearer bonds, will be held pending investigation, and if the fraud is confirmed, returned to the families and institutions that were defrauded. Claire nodded again, processing. Then she looked back at Marcus. And the money? All of it? All of it, he said. That's what he wanted. That's what he wrote. Something shifted in Claire's face then. Not relief. Not exactly. Something deeper. The expression of a woman who had spent 50 years believing her father had simply vanished, had simply stopped caring, had simply chosen the world over his daughter. And now, in the space of a single afternoon, that belief had been dismantled, not by proof that he had stayed, but by proof that he had left for a reason, that the silence had not been indifference, it had been sacrifice. She pressed her lips together tightly and looked down at the table. Marcus did not look away. He did not offer platitudes or empty comfort. He simply sat with her in the weight of it, the way he had once sat with families in the mountains, present, steady, holding the space for grief without trying to fill it. After a while, Claire looked up. Her eyes were wet, but her voice was steady when she spoke. I want to see it, she said. The cabin, all of it, before anyone else touches it. Marcus nodded. I'll take you. They went back up the mountain 2 days later, Marcus, Claire, and a small team from Sandra Voss's office, Agent Cole, a forensic accountant named James, and a quiet woman named Patricia, who specialized in document preservation. The snow had settled into a hard, walkable crust, and the sky was clear and cold, the kind of mountain air that burned your lungs in the best possible way. Claire walked beside Marcus the entire way up. She did not speak much, not out of discomfort, but out of the same careful attention Marcus had come to recognize in everything connected to Edwin Harlow. She was taking it in. The trees, the slope, the way the mountain closed around them as they climbed, the world below falling away until it was only the snow and the sky and the path ahead. When the cabin came into view, tucked against the mountainside, half buried in white, the stone chimney rising cold and silent, Claire stopped walking. She stood in the clearing and stared at it for a long time. The wind moved through the pines above her, a soft, constant sound, like breathing. The cabin sat there, patient and still, the way it had sat for nearly 50 years, waiting. Marcus watched her from a few steps back. He did not interrupt. Claire walked forward alone. She approached the door, lifted the latch the way Marcus had lifted it on that first night, and pushed it open. The groan of the hinges echoed across the clearing. She stepped inside and disappeared into the shadow. Marcus waited outside. He let the others wait with him. Agent Cole, James, Patricia, all of them standing in the cold, silent, understanding without being told that this moment was not theirs. It belonged to a woman and the ghost of a man who had loved her in the only way he knew how. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Then Claire appeared in the doorway. Her face was calm. Her eyes were red, but her jaw was set, and when she looked at Marcus, there was something in her expression he had not seen before. Not grief, not relief, something closer to resolution. The look of a woman who had found the last piece of a puzzle she had been assembling her entire life, and the picture it revealed was not what she had feared. He carved my name too, she said quietly, on the wall in the back room, behind the shelf. I wouldn't have seen it if I hadn't been looking. Marcus said nothing. He simply nodded. Claire took a breath. Then she turned to the team and said, "Let's get started." The work took weeks. Patricia and her team spent 12 days in the vault alone, cataloguing every document, photographing every page, creating a chain of custody that would hold up in any courtroom in the country. James, the forensic accountant, worked through the transaction records with the kind of obsessive precision that only people born to chase numbers possessed. By the end of the second week, he had confirmed what Marcus had suspected from the beginning. The fraud was not limited to the past. The network Edwin had documented was still active, operating under new names, new structures, but the same fundamental architecture, the same money moving through the same shadows. Sandra Voss built her case quietly. No press conferences, no leaked documents, no dramatic raids. She moved with the kind of careful, methodical authority that federal prosecutors learn over decades of work, the understanding that cases built on solid ground do not need spectacle. They need time, they need proof, and they need the kind of patience that outlasts the patience of the men on the other side. The arrests came in late spring, not all at once, but in a sequence, each one timed to prevent the others from destroying evidence or fleeing. 14 people in total. Some were executives at firms that had operated as fronts for Meridian's network for over 2 decades. Others were intermediaries, lawyers, bankers, accountants, who had facilitated the movement of money and asked no questions, because the questions would have cost them too much. Marcus watched the news coverage from a small apartment he had rented in a town an hour south of Bridger Falls. He watched Sandra Voss give a single, measured press conference in which she described the case in broad terms: decades of financial fraud, a trail of evidence preserved by a man who had risked everything to keep it alive, and the return of stolen funds to the families and institutions that had been defrauded. She did not mention Edwin by name. She did not mention the cabin or the mountain or the vault. Those details stayed quiet, the way Edwin would have wanted them to. The money took longer. Tracing the original victims, the people whose accounts had been siphoned over 30 years, required cross-referencing Edwin's meticulous records with banking archives, tax filings, and court documents from cases that had never been brought. It was painstaking work, the kind that moved in inches rather than miles. But it moved. Slowly, steadily, it moved. Claire called Marcus once a week during those months. Not to discuss the case. Sandra's office handled that. She called to talk. About Edwin, about the journal, about the passages she had read and reread, the ones where her father wrote about her, about the life he had left behind, about the guilt and the love and the impossible choice between the two. One evening in early summer, she called and said something that stayed with Marcus long after the conversation ended. "I spent my whole life thinking he left because I wasn't enough," she said. Her voice was steady, the way it always was. Edwin's discipline, inherited. That something about me, about us, wasn't worth staying for, and I spent 30 years being angry about it. She paused. But he didn't leave because we weren't enough. He left because we were. He left because the only way to protect what mattered most to him was to disappear. And he spent the rest of his life making sure that what he built, the record, the evidence, all of it, would outlast him. Another pause, longer this time. "I'm not angry anymore, Marcus. I'm not sad. I'm proud. For the first time in my life, I'm proud of my father." Marcus held the phone against his ear and said nothing. There was nothing to say. Some truths don't need words to land. They just need to be heard. He went back to the cabin in August. The summer had softened the mountain. The snow melted down to patches on the highest ridges, the trees full and green, the air warm with the kind of ease that only comes after a long winter. The path to the cabin was easier now, the ground firm beneath his boots, the creek he crossed running clear and fast with snowmelt. Birds sang in the canopy above. The mountain was alive in the way it only was for a few short months each year. The cabin looked different in summer light. Not smaller. If anything, the warmth and the green around it made it feel more substantial, more real. The stone chimney caught the sun. The wooden door, still hanging on its iron hinges, stood slightly ajar from the last time the preservation team had been through. Marcus pushed it open and stepped inside. The room was empty now. Not the crowded emptiness of dust and silence he had found that first night, but a true emptiness, the kind that comes after something has been carefully removed. The table was bare. The shelves were cleared. The glass jars and the tin cup and the wool blanket were gone, taken by Patricia's team for documentation and preservation. The fireplace was cold and clean, the hearth swept of ash. The only things that remained were the things that could not be moved: the log walls, the stone hearth, the carved names on the wall beside the doorway. Marcus walked to them and stood close, reading them one more time. Edwin, 1978. And beside it, smaller, lower, in a different hand. A hand Marcus had not noticed before, or had not looked closely enough to see, another name, Claire, with a date beside it, this August. Marcus stared at it. Claire had been here, recently. She had come back on her own without telling him, and she had carved her name into the wood beside her father's. Not to claim the place, not to mark territory, to connect, to stand in the same spot where Edwin had stood 47 years ago and leave a piece of herself in the same way he had, quietly, deliberately, as a sign for whoever might come after. Marcus touched the letters with his fingertips. The wood was fresh cut, the edges pale against the dark grain. It would darken with time, the way Edwin's had darkened. In 10 years, in 20, they would look like they had always been there, father and daughter, side by side on the wall of a cabin no one else would ever find. He turned and walked to the back room. The shelf where the journal had once sat was bare. The gap in the floor where the iron door waited was still there. Open, the door swung wide, the concrete steps descending into a vault that was now empty. Patricia's team had removed everything, documented everything, preserved everything. The chamber below was clean and dark and silent, the way it had been before Edwin first sealed it, and the way it would remain long after everyone involved in this story had moved on. Marcus descended the steps one last time. He stood at the bottom of the vault and looked around at the bare concrete walls, the empty shelves, the smooth floor where $265 million had once sat in quiet, patient rows. The space felt different now, not hollow but finished, the way a book feels when you close it after the last page, complete. He stood there for a long time, not thinking exactly, just breathing, just letting the silence hold him the way it had held Edwin for years, and the way it had held Marcus on that first night, when he stumbled in from the storm with nothing but a flashlight and the bone-deep exhaustion of a man who had stopped believing he had anything left to give. Something had changed in him since that night. It had not come all at once. It had crept in slowly, the way warmth creeps into cold hands held near a fire. Not a single moment of transformation, but a gradual accumulation of small ones. The moment he opened the journal. The moment he read Edwin's words about Claire. The moment he stood in the vault and understood what he was looking at. Not just money, not just evidence, but the quiet, stubborn remains of one man's belief that the truth was worth protecting. Marcus had come to this mountain broken. A man who had failed to save 2 boys and had decided in the aftermath that he was no longer capable of saving anything. He had sealed himself off from the world the way Edwin had sealed the vault, not to protect something precious, but to protect himself from the pain of trying and failing again. But Edwin's story had shown him something he had not expected to find in a dead man's handwriting on a shelf in a forgotten cabin. It had shown him that the decision to act was not about certainty. It was not about knowing you would succeed or that the outcome would justify the risk. It was about believing, with whatever small, flickering flame of faith you had left, that the attempt itself mattered. That showing up, even imperfectly, even frightened, even with no guarantee of anything, was the only thing that separated a life lived from a life surrendered. Edwin had surrendered many things: his identity, his freedom, his relationship with his daughter, his place in the world. But he had not surrendered the truth. He had carried it up a mountain and buried it in concrete and steel and waited with infinite patience for someone to come and finish what he started. Marcus had finished it, not alone. Sandra Voss had built the case. Claire had given it heart. Agent Cole and her team had done the work that made it stick. But Marcus had been the one to open the door. The one who had stood at the threshold and chosen to step through when every instinct in him said to walk away and let the mountain keep its secrets. He climbed the stairs one last time, walked through the back room, stood in the main room, in the center of the space where the fire had once burned and the journal had once sat open on the table. The sunlight came through the shuttered windows in thin golden bars, falling across the floor in warm stripes. Marcus stood in one of them and let it hit his face. Outside, the mountain was alive with summer, birdsong and wind and the distant rush of water moving downhill toward the valley. The world went on. It always did. But here, in this small cabin on a ridge, no one would ever find. The story had its ending. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind that filled headlines or changed the shape of history in ways people would remember. A quiet ending. The kind that belongs to men like Edwin Harlow, men who do their work in silence and leave the credit to the world that comes after. Marcus walked to the door and paused with his hand on the latch. He looked back at the cabin one last time, at the walls and the hearth and the names carved into the wood, at the place where a man had hidden a lifetime of courage and where another man had found it, and where a daughter had come back to leave her own mark beside her father's. Then he stepped outside, pulled the door closed behind him, and walked down the mountain. The sun was warm on his back. The trail was clear. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Marcus did not feel like a man walking away from something. He felt like a man walking toward it, because some doors, once opened, change everything on the other side. And some stories, the quiet ones, the ones no one else will ever hear, are the ones that matter most. The ones that remind us what it means to show up when the world is dark and cold and the path ahead is invisible, and choose with whatever you have left to keep going. Edwin Harlow chose that, and in the end so did Marcus. And sometimes that is enough. That is more than enough. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories of secrets, courage, and the kind of discoveries that change everything. Click to keep watching, and don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the quietest choices can change the world.